When a racist bus driver kicks a little black girl off on a deserted road, he has no idea that his actions will have shocking consequences. What happens next will make you rethink justice and fortitude. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment about where you're watching from. The sun rose quietly over the modest neighborhood, its warm golden rays spilling through the thin curtains of the White family's small but welcoming home. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as the city slowly stirred awake, the faint hum of early morning activity creating a gentle backdrop for the day ahead. Inside the kitchen, Amelia White moved with calm precision. Her tailored blouse was crisp and her short curls were neatly styled. She carried an air of authority, a quiet confidence that made people listen. But beneath her composed exterior was a deep, unwavering love for her family, especially for her 12-year-old daughter, Melanie. Melanie sat at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly poking at her cereal. The spoon clinked against the porcelain in a slow, rhythmic motion. Her mind was clouded with worry, her thoughts distant as a mix of anxiety and dread settled in her chest. Today felt heavier than most. Amelia noticed the untouched cereal, the slouched shoulders, the way Melanie seemed to shrink into herself. Gently, she placed a firm but reassuring hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You need your strength, sweetheart. Big things happen when you're ready to take them on," she said, her voice both encouraging and steady. Melanie looked up, her wide brown eyes filled with uncertainty. She hesitated, stirring her cereal until it turned into a soggy mess. "Mom," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible, "do you ever feel like everything you do just makes it harder for people to like us?" The question caught Amelia off guard. For a moment she froze, the weight of it settling over her like a heavy blanket. She crouched beside Melanie, meeting her at eye level. "What do you mean, honey?" she asked softly. Melanie sighed, her fingers tightening around the spoon. "It's just being the mayor's daughter. People don't like you because you're changing things. They think you're taking things away from them, and they think I'm different." Amelia's eyes softened. She had always known that being the city's first black mayor would come with challenges, but it stung to see that burden weighing on her daughter. "Melanie, people resist change because it scares them. But change is what helps us grow," Amelia said, her voice steady with conviction. "I need you to remember that. When people see someone brave enough to do what's right, it makes them uncomfortable. But it's worth it." Melanie tried to muster a smile but couldn't quite manage it. She looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just don't want to be the reason people act like that." Amelia stood, brushing a soft kiss against her daughter's forehead. "You're not the reason," she said gently. "You're part of the solution, and that's something to be proud of." The distant rumble of the school bus interrupted their conversation. Melanie sighed, grabbing her backpack reluctantly. Her shoulders slumped under its weight, though it wasn't just the books making it feel heavy. Amelia watched her leave, pride and unease intertwining in her chest. She wished she could shield Melanie from the world's harshness, but she also knew her daughter was stronger than she realized. Outside, the bus screeched to a halt. The doors hissed open, revealing Jack Hunter, the driver. He sat hunched over the wheel, his face weathered and his expression hard. His graying beard was unkempt, and his uniform looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. Melanie hesitated for a second before stepping onto the bus. Jack barely glanced at her, his only acknowledgement a grunt that sounded more like irritation than a greeting. She kept her head down as she walked through the narrow aisle. The bus was filled with chatter and laughter, but the moment she passed by, the volume dipped slightly, a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of her presence that only made her feel more isolated. Sliding into an empty seat near the middle, she clutched her backpack tightly against her chest. Jack's eyes flicked briefly to the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of her. A sneer tugged at the corner of his mouth, but he said nothing. Instead, he revved the engine and pulled the bus back onto the road with a rough jerk, making everyone sway in their seats. Melanie stared out the window, trying to ignore the unease that settled deep in her stomach every time she rode this bus. Melanie kept her head down as she moved through the narrow aisle of the school bus. The air buzzed with the chatter and laughter of other kids, but as she passed, the noise seemed to dip slightly, a subtle acknowledgement of her presence that only made her feel more alone. She slid into an empty seat near the middle, clutching her backpack tightly against her chest, as if it could shield her from the weight of the moment. Jack Hunter's eyes flicked to the rear-view mirror, catching a glimpse of Melanie. A sneer tugged at the corner of his mouth, but he said nothing. Instead, he revved the engine and pulled the bus back onto the road with an unnecessary jerk, making everyone sway in their seats. Melanie stared out the window, forcing herself to focus on the scenery. She tried to push down the unease that always crept up when she rode with Jack. At first, the ride was uneventful. The bus rattled over potholes, the hum of conversation filling the space. Melanie let her mind drift, trying to pretend she wasn't there, tuning out the voices around her. But then, Jack's voice cut through the air like a sharp blade. "Well, looks like royalty decided to grace us with her presence again," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. A few kids stifled giggles, while others looked away, unwilling to be involved. Melanie's cheeks burned, but she didn't react. She had learned long ago that silence was often the best defense against people like Jack. Still, the sting of his words settled heavily in her chest. Jack wasn't done. He chuckled to himself before adding, "Bet it must be nice having a mom who tells everyone else what to do. Maybe she should teach you how to sit still and keep quiet." Melanie's grip tightened on the straps of her backpack, her knuckles turning white. She kept her gaze fixed on the passing buildings, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. But deep down, the humiliation cut through her, leaving a lump in her throat. When the bus finally pulled up to the school, Melanie was one of the first to get off. She hurried down the steps, keeping her head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Her heart pounded as she moved toward the entrance, her face still flushed with embarrassment and anger. She didn't look back at Jack, but she could feel his eyes on her, a lingering reminder of how powerless she felt. Inside the school, she tried to shake off the morning's events, but the tension clung to her like a shadow. She spent the day quietly navigating her classes, keeping to herself and avoiding unnecessary attention. By the time the final bell rang, she felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that the school day was over, dread at the thought of getting back on that bus. The afternoon ride home was no better. Jack's attitude remained hostile, his comments sharp, his disdain obvious. Melanie sat in silence, counting the minutes until she could escape the suffocating atmosphere. When they finally reached her stop, she bolted out the door without a backward glance, her legs carrying her as fast as they could toward the safety of home. Amelia was waiting for her at the door, a warm smile on her face. "How was your day?" Melanie hesitated. Jack's sneering face flashed in her mind, along with the quiet laughter of her classmates. She forced a weak smile. "It was fine," she lied. Amelia studied her daughter's face, but decided not to press. Instead, she opened her arms, and Melanie stepped into her embrace, finding a brief moment of solace in her mother's strength. As the evening settled in, Melanie couldn't shake the weight of the day, the unspoken hostility, the quiet humiliation. It was exhausting. She didn't know how much longer she could endure it, but for now she found comfort in her mother's presence. Little did she know the events of tomorrow would test her resilience in ways she could never have imagined. The morning sun barely broke through the thick clouds as Melanie stood at the curb, clutching her backpack with both hands. The air felt heavier today, as though the world itself knew something was about to go wrong. She tried to steady her breathing, focusing on the rhythm of the approaching bus. Its familiar groan echoed down the quiet street, a metallic reminder of the uneasy truths she faced every day. The bus screeched to a halt in front of her, the doors hissing open. Jack Hunter's sour expression greeted her, his tired eyes flicking toward her with something that resembled disdain more than acknowledgement. He didn't bother with a greeting. Instead, his hands gripped the steering wheel as he waited impatiently for her to climb aboard. Melanie hesitated for just a second before stepping onto the bus. The atmosphere inside felt just as stifling as ever. Kids were scattered across the seats, their conversations continuing as though nothing had changed. But as Melanie walked down the aisle, the same quiet acknowledgement rippled through the space. A few students stole glances at her. Others looked away. She slid into her usual spot, near the middle, pressing her forehead against the window. Maybe today, if she stayed quiet, if she took up as little space as possible, he would leave her alone. Jack pulled the bus back onto the road with a forceful lurch. For the first few minutes, everything was calm. Melanie allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that she might get through this ride without incident. Then Jack's voice rang out. "Better than the rest of us, don't you?" His voice was louder this time, more pointed. "Well, news flash, kid. Out here, you're just another passenger. No special treatment." A few murmurs spread through the bus. Someone snickered. Melanie's heart pounded. She stared hard at the passing scenery, willing herself to disappear. Jack wasn't done. His voice dripped with mockery. "Maybe your mama can tell everyone else how to run things, but she doesn't control this bus, and neither do you." The words hung in the air, thick with hostility. The bus turned onto a stretch of road surrounded by dense trees. The city was behind them now, replaced by long stretches of quiet isolation. Then, without warning, the bus lurched to a stop. Melanie's body jerked forward slightly. Confused murmurs rippled through the seats. Jack turned in his seat, his eyes locking onto her. "You!" he barked. His voice was sharp enough to cut through the silence. "Out!" Melanie's stomach dropped. "What?" she whispered, barely able to process what he had just said. "I said get off my bus," Jack repeated, his voice rising. "You think you're too good for this ride? Fine, walk." The bus fell silent. Even the students who had laughed before now sat frozen, their wide eyes darting between Melanie and Jack. Melanie's hands trembled as she clutched her backpack. "You can't do that," she managed to say. Jack leaned closer, his face twisted with smug satisfaction. "I can do whatever I damn well please." For a moment nobody moved. Then, slowly, Melanie stood. The weight of every silent witness pressed against her as she made her way toward the front. Jack leaned in, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Maybe this will teach you and your mama to stay in your lane." The doors hissed open, and just like that, Melanie stepped onto the side of the road, alone. Jack's tired eyes flicked toward her with something that resembled disdain more than acknowledgement. He didn't bother with a greeting. Instead, his hands gripped the steering wheel, his fingers tightening as he waited impatiently for her to climb aboard. Melanie stepped onto the bus, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the worn rubber flooring. The atmosphere inside was as stifling as ever. Children were scattered across the seats, their chatter momentarily softening as they noticed her. She didn't look up, focusing instead on finding her usual spot halfway down the aisle. Sliding into the seat nearest the window, she let her small frame sink into the worn fabric. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, hoping this ride would be uneventful. Jack glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his lip curling slightly. He revved the engine with unnecessary force, and the bus lurched forward, jolting Melanie against her seat. She gritted her teeth, gripping the edge of the seat for balance as the vehicle settled into its usual, rattling pace. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. The hum of conversation filled the space, voices overlapping in a familiar rhythm. Melanie let herself focus on the passing streets, her mind drifting to the day ahead. But the illusion of peace shattered when Jack's voice sliced through the noise. "Well, looks like our little Miss Royalty is gracing us with her presence again," he muttered, his voice dripping with mockery. Though the words were spoken casually, they carried across the bus, drawing attention. Melanie felt the familiar burn of embarrassment creep up her cheeks. She clenched her jaw, staring harder out the window, pretending not to hear him. The bus grew quieter. The usual chatter dimmed as students exchanged nervous glances. Some were unsure whether to laugh, while others shifted uncomfortably. Jack wasn't finished. He glanced at the mirror again, clearly enjoying the way Melanie's shoulders tensed. Must be nice, having a mom who thinks she's in charge of everything. Bet she's teaching you how to boss people around, huh? A faint snicker came from the back of the bus. Melanie's grip on her backpack tightened, her knuckles turning white. She refused to give Jack the satisfaction of a reaction. The bus continued its rattling journey, but the atmosphere had thickened. The tension sat heavy in the air. Jack's jabs grew bolder, his voice laced with venom. "Bet you think you're better than the rest of us, don't you?" he sneered. "Well, newsflash, kid. Out here, you're just another passenger. No special treatment." Melanie's heart pounded, each word cut deeper than the last. She fought back the sting of tears threatening to surface, knowing they would only make things worse. She tried to remind herself of her mother's words, that strength came from standing tall in the face of adversity. But at this moment, strength felt like an impossible luxury. The bus turned onto a stretch of quiet road, the bustling city streets fading into empty fields and dense woods. The chatter had all but disappeared. The other students, sensing a shift in Jack's demeanor, sat still, watching warily. Jack's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles whitening as he guided the bus toward the side of the road. With a sudden jolt, the bus came to an abrupt stop. The force of it threw Melanie forward slightly, her backpack sliding off her lap. Confused murmurs rippled through the bus. Students looked around, their faces filled with uncertainty. Jack turned in his seat, his eyes locking onto Melanie with a cold, unwavering stare. "Ryu," he barked, his voice sharp. "Out." Melanie's stomach dropped. "What?" she whispered, barely audible. "You heard me," Jack repeated, his voice rising. "Get off my bus." A few students gasped. Others sat frozen, their eyes darting between Melanie and Jack. Melanie's pulse quickened. She searched for help, for someone to speak up, but no one did. The silence was suffocating. "You can't do that," she managed to say, her voice trembling. Jack leaned forward, his expression hardening. "I can do whatever I damn well please. Now get off." For a moment she stayed frozen in her seat, her body refusing to move. Jack's glare darkened. "Get off." Slowly Melanie stood. Her legs felt like lead as she made her way toward the front. She could feel the stares of her classmates boring into her back, a mixture of pity, fear, and shame. As she reached the door, Jack leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Maybe this will teach you and your mama to stay in your lane." The doors hissed open. Melanie stepped out onto the dusty shoulder of the road. The heat of the sun bore down on her as the bus doors slammed shut behind her. She stood there, stunned, as the bus roared back onto the road, its engine fading into the distance. She looked around, realizing just how isolated she was. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, flanked by tall grass and dense woods. There was no sign of another vehicle, no indication of how far she was from home or safety. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the straps of her backpack. The reality of her situation sank in. She was alone, miles from home, with no one to help her. A single tear slipped down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. Crying wouldn't get her anywhere. She had to move. Taking a deep breath, Melanie began walking. The road stretched ahead, long and unforgiving, and every step felt heavier than the last. To cry, not here, not now. She pressed on, trying to focus on the rhythm of her steps. The sun beat down mercilessly and sweat trickled down the sides of her face. Her throat felt dry and she realized with regret that she hadn't brought any water. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, smearing dirt and sweat across her skin. Memories of the morning flashed through her mind, each one a sharp reminder of how unfairly she had been treated. Jack's mocking words echoed in her head and her chest tightened with a mix of anger and humiliation. She thought of her classmates, their averted eyes, their silence that spoke louder than words. No one had stood up for her. No one had even tried. A gust of wind rustled the tall grass beside her, and Melanie jumped, her pulse quickening. She glanced nervously toward the trees, half expecting something to emerge from the shadows. She had heard stories about wild animals in the area, coyotes, stray dogs. Her imagination began to spiral, conjuring images of glowing eyes and sharp teeth. She shook her head, pushing the thoughts away. There was nothing out here. She was just scaring herself. The road stretched on, a ribbon of gray cutting through the landscape. Her legs ached, and her pace slowed as the heat sapped her energy. She stopped for a moment, crouching at the side of the road to catch her breath. The dry grass scratched against her arms, its brittle texture prickling her skin. She tried to remember the last time she had seen a car pass by. It had been hours, maybe more. The isolation pressed down on her like a physical weight. As she sat there, she thought of her mother. Amelia White, strong, fearless, determined. Her mother would know what to do. She always did. Melanie pictured her sitting in her office, surrounded by stacks of papers, her phone buzzing with calls. Despite the chaos, Amelia always had time for her, always made her feel important. The memory brought a faint smile to her face, but it quickly faded when she realized the truth. Her mother didn't know where she was, and Melanie had no way to reach her. Her chest tightened, and for a moment she felt the familiar sting of tears. She blinked rapidly, refusing to let them fall. Her mother wouldn't cry in a situation like this. Her mother would keep moving no matter what. The sound of an approaching engine broke through her thoughts, and Melanie's head snapped up. She scrambled to her feet, her heart racing as she turned toward the noise. A beat-up pickup truck appeared on the horizon. Its dull red paint faded from years of use. She hesitated, uncertainty and hope battling in her mind. As the truck approached, it slowed. Melanie's pulse quickened. The driver, a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, leaned out the window. His face was lined with years of hard living. "You lost, kid?" he asked, his voice rough but not unkind. Melanie nodded, her throat too dry to speak. She cleared it and managed to croak, "I need to get home." The man studied her for a moment, his brow furrowing. "Where's home?" She hesitated. Her mother had always told her to be cautious around strangers. But what choice did she have? "In town," she said finally, her voice small. "About 5 miles from here." The man scratched his chin, glancing at the empty road behind her. "You've been walking this whole time?" She nodded again. He let out a low whistle. "Well, hop in. Ain't right for a kid to be out here alone." She hesitated, glancing at the truck's rusted exterior and the pile of tools and rags in the passenger seat. Something about the man seemed rough but not threatening. Still, a small voice in the back of her mind urged caution. "I'm okay," she said quickly. "I'll keep walking." The man shrugged. "Suit yourself, but it's a long way, and it's only going to get hotter." The truck rumbled forward, leaving Melanie standing in its wake. She watched it disappear down the road, a pang of regret tugging at her. Maybe she should have taken the ride. But the thought of being trapped in a stranger's vehicle made her stomach churn. As the truck disappeared over the horizon, Melanie turned back toward the road. Her legs felt heavier with each step, and the sun seemed even harsher now. The fields on either side of her blurred together, their golden hues merging into a sea of sameness. She tried to focus on the rhythm of her steps, counting them in her head to keep herself moving. Her thoughts drifted to her mother again, and this time a memory surfaced. A warm summer evening when she was 8 years old. They had gone to a park on the edge of town, and Amelia had taught her how to ride a bike. Melanie had fallen at least a dozen times, scraping her knees and elbows, but her mother had been patient, encouraging her to get back up every time. "Strength isn't about never falling," Amelia had said as she wiped the dirt from Melanie's hands. "It's about getting up, no matter how many times you fall." The memory brought a small smile to Melanie's face, and she straightened her shoulders, pushing through the fatigue. She would get home. She had to. The road ahead curved slightly, and as she rounded the bend, she spotted something in the distance. A small, weathered shack nestled at the edge of the trees. It looked abandoned, its paint peeling, its roof sagging. But the sight of it gave her a flicker of hope. Maybe there was water, or at least some shade where she could rest. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding as she approached the shack. As she drew closer, a figure emerged from the shadows. A tall, gaunt man with unkempt hair and a scruffy beard. Melanie's breath caught in her throat. The man noticed her and raised a hand in a cautious wave. "Don't be scared," he called, his voice rough but not threatening. "Just passing through." Melanie hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run. But the man stayed where he was, his posture relaxed. "You look like you've been walking a long time," he said. "You need water?" Her throat burned with thirst, and the offer was tempting. She took a tentative step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You have water?" she asked hesitantly. He nodded, reaching into a small pack slung over his shoulder. He pulled out a battered plastic bottle and held it out to her. "Here, take it." Melanie approached slowly, her heart pounding. She took the bottle and twisted off the cap. The cool liquid soothed her parched throat. The man watched her with a faint smile, his eyes kind but tired. "Long road ahead," he said. "You be careful out here." Melanie nodded, clutching the bottle tightly. "Thank you," she murmured. The man tipped his hat, then turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving Melanie alone once more. She refused to cry. Not here, not now. Melanie pressed on, forcing herself to focus on the rhythm of her steps. The sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat trickled down the sides of her face. Her throat felt dry, and a pang of regret hit her as she realized she hadn't brought a water bottle. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, smearing dirt and sweat across her skin. Memories of the morning flooded her mind, each one a sharp reminder of how unfairly she had been treated. Jack's mocking words echoed in her head, making her chest tighten with anger and humiliation. She thought of her classmates, their averted eyes, their silence that had been louder than words. No one had stood up for her. No one had even tried. A gust of wind rustled the tall grass beside her, and Melanie jumped, her pulse quickening. She glanced nervously toward the trees, half expecting something to emerge from the shadows. She had heard stories about wild animals in the area, coyotes, stray dogs. Her imagination started to spiral, conjuring images of glowing eyes and sharp teeth lurking in the darkness. She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. There was nothing out there, she was just scaring herself. The road stretched on, a long ribbon of gray cutting through the landscape. Her legs ached and her pace slowed as the relentless heat sapped her energy. She stopped for a moment, crouching on the side of the road to catch her breath. The dry grass scratched against her arms, its brittle texture prickling her skin. She tried to remember the last time she had seen a car pass by. It had been hours, maybe more. The isolation pressed down on her like a physical weight. As she sat there, she thought of her mother. Amelia White. Strong, fearless, determined. Her mother would know what to do. She always did. Melanie pictured her sitting in her office, surrounded by stacks of papers, her phone buzzing with calls. Despite the chaos, Amelia always had time for her, always made her feel important. The memory brought a faint smile to her face, but it quickly faded when reality sank in. Her mother didn't know where she was. She had no way to contact her. The thought made her chest tighten, and for a moment she felt the familiar sting of tears. She blinked rapidly, refusing to let them fall. Her mother wouldn't cry in a situation like this. Her mother would keep moving, no matter what. The distant hum of an engine broke through her thoughts, and Melanie's head snapped up. She scrambled to her feet, her heart racing as she turned toward the sound. A beat-up pickup truck appeared on the horizon. Its dull red paint faded from years of wear and tear. She hesitated, uncertainty and hope battling in her mind. She stepped closer to the road, raising one hand tentatively as the truck approached. It slowed down, and Melanie's pulse quickened. The driver, a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, leaned out the window. His face was lined with years of hard living. "You lost, kid?" he asked, his voice rough but not unkind. Melanie nodded, her throat too dry to speak. She cleared it and managed to croak, "I need to get home." The man studied her for a moment, his brow furrowing. "Where's home?" She hesitated. Her mother had always told her to be cautious around strangers, but what choice did she have? "In town," she said finally, her voice small. "About 5 miles from here." The man scratched his chin, glancing at the empty road behind her. "You've been walking this whole time?" She nodded again. He let out a low whistle. "Well, hop in. Ain't right for a kid to be out here alone." She hesitated, glancing at the truck's rusted exterior and the pile of tools and rags in the passenger seat. Something about the man seemed rough, but not threatening. Still, a small voice in the back of her mind urged caution. "I'm okay," she said quickly. "I'll keep walking." The man shrugged. "Suit yourself. But it's a long way, and it's only going to get hotter." The truck rumbled forward, leaving Melanie standing in its wake. She watched it disappear down the road, a pang of regret tugging at her. Maybe she should have taken the ride, but the thought of being trapped in a stranger's vehicle made her stomach churn. As the truck disappeared over the horizon, Melanie turned back toward the road. Her legs felt heavier with each step, and the sun seemed even harsher now. The fields on either side of her blurred together, their golden hues merging into a sea of sameness. She tried to focus on the rhythm of her steps, counting them in her head to keep herself moving. Her thoughts drifted to her mother again, and this time a memory surfaced. A warm summer evening when she was 8 years old. They had gone to a park on the edge of town, and Amelia had taught her how to ride a bike. Melanie had fallen at least a dozen times, scraping her knees and elbows. But her mother had been patient, encouraging her to get back up every time. "Strength isn't about never falling," Amelia had said as she wiped the dirt from Melanie's hands. "It's about getting up, no matter how many times you fall." The memory brought a small smile to Melanie's face, and she straightened her shoulders, pushing through the fatigue. She would get home. She had to. The road ahead curved slightly, and as she rounded the bend, she spotted something in the distance. A small, weathered shack nestled at the edge of the trees. It looked abandoned, its paint peeling, its roof sagging. But the sight of it gave her a flicker of hope. Maybe there was water, or at least some shade where she could rest. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding as she approached the shack. As she drew closer, a figure emerged from the shadows. A tall, gaunt man with unkempt hair and a scruffy beard. Melanie's breath caught in her throat. The man noticed her and raised a hand in a cautious wave. "Don't be scared," he called, his voice rough but not threatening. "Just passing through." Melanie hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run. But the man stayed where he was, his posture relaxed. "You look like you've been walking a long time," he said. "You need water?" Her throat burned with thirst, and the offer was tempting. She took a tentative step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You have water?" she asked hesitantly. He nodded, reaching into a small pack slung over his shoulder. He pulled out a battered plastic bottle and held it out to her. "Here, take it." Melanie approached slowly, her heart pounding. She took the bottle and twisted off the cap. The cool liquid soothed her parched throat. The man watched her with a faint smile, his eyes kind but tired. "Long road ahead," he said. "You be careful out here." Melanie nodded, clutching the bottle tightly. "Thank you," she murmured. The man tipped his hat, then turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving Melanie alone once more. The man scratched his chin, glancing at the empty road behind her. "You've been walking this whole time?" Melanie nodded again, and the man let out a low whistle. "Well, hop in. Ain't right for a kid to be out here alone." She hesitated, her eyes flicking to the truck's rusted exterior and the pile of tools and rags scattered across the passenger seat. Something about the man seemed rough, but not necessarily dangerous. Still, a small voice in the back of her mind urged caution. "I'm okay," she said quickly. "I'll keep walking." The man shrugged. "Suit yourself, but it's a long way, and it's only going to get hotter." He shifted gears, and the truck rumbled forward, kicking up dust as it disappeared down the road. Melanie stood there, watching it fade into the distance, a pang of regret tugging at her. Maybe she should have taken the ride, but the thought of being trapped in a stranger's vehicle made her stomach churn. Turning back toward the road, she forced herself to keep moving. Her legs felt heavier with each step, and the sun burned hotter against her skin. The fields on either side of her blurred together, their golden hues merging into a sea of endless sameness. She tried to focus on the rhythm of her steps, counting them in her head to keep herself moving. Her thoughts drifted to her mother again, and this time a memory surfaced. A warm summer evening when she was 8 years old. They had gone to a park on the edge of town, and Amelia had taught her how to ride a bike. Melanie had fallen at least a dozen times, scraping her knees and elbows, but her mother had been patient, encouraging her to get back up every time. "Strength isn't about never falling," Amelia had said, wiping the dirt from Melanie's hands. "It's about getting up no matter how many times you fall." The memory brought a small smile to Melanie's face, and she straightened her shoulders, pushing through the fatigue. She would get home. She had to. The road ahead curved slightly, and as she rounded the bend, she spotted something in the distance. A small, weathered shack nestled at the edge of the trees. It looked abandoned, its paint peeling, its roof sagging. But the sight of it gave her a flicker of hope. Maybe there was water, or at least some shade where she could rest. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding as she approached the shack. As she drew closer, a figure emerged from the shadows. A tall, gaunt man with unkempt hair and a scruffy beard. He wore tattered clothes and held a walking stick in one hand. Melanie froze, her breath catching in her throat. The man noticed her and raised a hand in a cautious wave. "Don't be scared," he called, his voice rough but not threatening. "Just passing through." Melanie hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run. But the man stayed where he was, his posture relaxed. "You look like you've been walking a long time," he said. "You need water?" Her throat burned with thirst, and the offer was tempting. She took a tentative step closer, her eyes never leaving him. "You have water?" she asked hesitantly. He nodded, reaching into a small pack slung over his shoulder. He pulled out a battered plastic bottle and held it out to her. "Here, take it." Melanie approached slowly, her heart pounding. She took the bottle and twisted off the cap. The cool liquid soothed her parched throat, and she nearly sighed in relief. The man watched her with a faint smile, his eyes kind but tired. "Long road ahead," he said. "You be careful out here." Melanie nodded, clutching the bottle tightly. "Thank you," she murmured. The man tipped his hat, then turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving Melanie alone once more. She stared after him for a moment before turning back to the road. Her legs still ached and her body felt heavy, but the water had revived her spirit. She squared her shoulders and kept walking, her mother's voice echoing in her mind. "It's about getting up no matter how many times you fall." Restless sleep. The night passed in uneasy waves. Melanie tossed and turned, her dreams filled with fragments of the day. Jack's cruel sneer, the suffocating heat of the road, the silence of her classmates, and the stranger who had offered her water. She woke up multiple times, her heart pounding, unsure for a moment if she was still walking that endless road. When morning arrived, sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, casting long streaks across her room. Her muscles still ached and a dull headache throbbed at her temples. She sat up slowly, wincing as she stretched her stiff limbs. Downstairs, the scent of fresh coffee and toast drifted through the air. Amelia, ever the early riser, was already up, moving about the kitchen with her usual quiet efficiency. Melanie hesitated before getting out of bed, dreading the conversation she knew was coming. With a deep breath, she made her way downstairs. Amelia glanced up from the stove, her eyes immediately scanning Melanie's face for any sign of distress. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "How are you feeling?" Melanie shrugged as she slid into her seat at the kitchen table. "Fine." Amelia set a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her. "Eat," she instructed. "You barely touched your dinner last night." Melanie picked at the toast, her appetite non-existent. She could feel her mother's gaze on her, waiting, patient but persistent. Finally, Amelia sighed and sat across from her. "I don't want to push you," she said carefully, "but I need to know what happened yesterday. I know you, Melanie. Something is wrong." Melanie stared at her plate, willing herself to stay composed, but her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her fork. She could lie, say she was just tired, say the heat had gotten to her, but Amelia would see through it. After a long pause, she whispered, "Jack made me get off the bus." Silence. Amelia's expression didn't change at first, but her fingers curled slightly against the table. "He what?" she asked, her voice deceptively calm. Melanie swallowed hard. "He pulled over in the middle of nowhere and told me to get out. Said I could walk the rest of the way." Amelia's entire posture stiffened, the controlled rage simmering beneath the surface of her usually composed demeanor. "And you did? You walked all the way home?" Melanie nodded. Amelia closed her eyes for a brief moment, inhaling deeply before exhaling slowly. When she looked at Melanie again, her expression was fierce, protective. "Did he say anything to you before he did it?" Melanie hesitated. "He's always mean to me. He calls me names, says my mom thinks she runs everything." Her voice wavered. "He didn't like that I was on his bus." Amelia stood up abruptly, pushing her chair back with enough force to make it scrape against the floor. She grabbed her phone off the counter, her movements sharp and precise. "Mom, please," Melanie pleaded. "I don't want to make a big deal out of it." Amelia turned to face her, her expression filled with both anger and an unwavering love. "Sweetheart, this is a big deal. He left you alone on a deserted road. He humiliated you in front of your classmates. And he thinks he can get away with it." Melanie looked down at her hands. "I just didn't want to cause trouble." Amelia crouched beside her, gently placing a hand on her daughter's knee. "This is not your fault," she said firmly. "Jack Hunter made a choice, and now I'm going to make sure he answers for it." Melanie nodded, her throat tight. For the first time since stepping off that bus, she didn't feel quite so alone. Amelia straightened, already dialing a number. "First, I'm calling the principal. Then, I'm calling the school board. And if they don't handle this immediately, I'll make sure every parent in this town knows exactly what kind of man is driving their children to school." Melanie watched as her mother paced the kitchen, speaking with sharp authority into the phone. Maybe Jack thought she was powerless. Maybe he thought no one would believe her. But he was about to find out just how wrong he was. "White, do you have an appointment?" "No." "But I need to speak with Principal Edwards immediately," Amelia said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. The receptionist, recognizing the urgency in her voice, nodded. "Please have a seat. I'll let him know you're here." Amelia glanced around the waiting area, the distant chatter of students in the hallways blending with the rustle of papers and the occasional ringing of a phone. She could feel the tension building inside her, her patience wearing thin as she replayed Melanie's words in her mind. After a few minutes, Principal Edwards appeared, a tall, balding man with wire-rimmed glasses and a slightly harried expression. He extended a hand in greeting. "Mayor White, what brings you in this morning?" Amelia shook his hand firmly. "We need to discuss one of your bus drivers. It's a matter of my daughter's safety." His expression shifted, concern flickering in his eyes. "Of course. Let's..." Step into my office." Inside the modestly furnished office, Amelia took a seat across from Edward's, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. He settled into his chair, leaning forward slightly. "What seems to be the issue?" "My daughter Melanie came home yesterday after walking several miles from a deserted stretch of road," Amelia said, her voice controlled but firm. "She was forced off the school bus by Jack Hunter." Principal Edward's brows lifted in surprise. "Forced off the bus?" "Yes," Amelia continued. "He pulled over, ordered her to get off, and drove away, leaving a 12-year-old girl alone miles from home. He has a history of making derogatory remarks toward her, belittling her in front of other students, and abusing his position. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was targeted harassment." The principal's jaw tightened. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. "I wasn't aware of any complaints against Mr. Hunter before now." Amelia's eyes narrowed. "That doesn't mean there haven't been any. It means no one was listening." Edward shifted in his chair. "Mayor White, I take this very seriously. We have protocols for handling complaints against staff, and I assure you this will be investigated thoroughly." "With all due respect, protocols aren't enough," Amelia said, her voice steely. "This isn't just about my daughter. If he feels entitled to treat one student this way, how many others have suffered in silence? This man needs to be held accountable, not just investigated." The principal hesitated before nodding. "I'll call Mr. Hunter in for questioning today. Until then, I'll place him on administrative leave." Amelia's lips pressed into a thin line. It wasn't immediate termination, but it was a start. "Thank you," she said, standing. "But let me be clear. If the resolution doesn't ensure the safety of every student, I will take this to the school board and the press." Edwards nodded, understood. Amelia left the office, her heels clicking against the floor with sharp determination. Meanwhile, at school, Melanie could feel the weight of curious eyes on her. Whispers followed her through the hallways. "Heard the mayor's kid got kicked off the bus. Bet her mom's making a huge deal out of it. Jack's been here forever. He wouldn't do that for no reason." Melanie kept her head down, trying to ignore the murmurs, but when Darius, a boy from her homeroom, caught up to her at lunch, he slid into the seat across from her with a knowing look. "Yo, you okay?" he asked, his voice low. Melanie hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." Darius tilted his head. "You know Jack's always been a jerk, right? You ain't the first kid he's messed with. Just the first one whose mom might actually do something about it." Melanie glanced up, startled. "Really?" Darius said he's been picking on kids for years, but nobody ever listens when we complain. Maybe now they will. A new thought settled in Melanie's mind. This wasn't just about her. It never was. That evening, Amelia sat at the kitchen table, flipping through emails when her phone rang. She answered immediately. "Mayor White?" Principal Edwards said, his voice careful. "We've completed our initial investigation. Several students have come forward with similar complaints about Mr. Hunter. Given the severity of the situation, the school board has decided to terminate his employment, effective immediately." Amelia exhaled, her body releasing the tension she'd carried all day. "Good. And I expect new policies to be put in place to ensure nothing like this happens again." "We're already working on it," Edwards assured her. "Mandatory cameras on all buses, stricter hiring protocols, and additional training for drivers." "That's a start," Amelia said. After hanging up, she turned to Melanie, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway. "He's gone," Amelia said simply. Melanie's shoulders sagged in relief. "So it's over?" Amelia gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Not over, but better." For the first time in days, Melanie felt lighter. She wasn't just a girl who had been thrown off a bus. She was a girl who had stood up for herself and, in doing so, made things safer for others. And that was something worth holding on to. Jack leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. "What kind of concern?" he asked, his voice laced with feigned nonchalance. Amelia didn't wait for Principal Edwards to speak. She leveled her gaze at Jack, her voice sharp and unwavering. "Yesterday you forced my daughter off the school bus, leaving her alone on a deserted road miles from home. You humiliated her in front of her classmates and endangered her safety. Care to explain?" Jack's jaw tightened, but he smirked. "I didn't force anyone off the bus," he said with a shrug. "She was disruptive. I told her to behave and she decided to leave." Amelia's eyes narrowed. A 12-year-old girl voluntarily chose to get off a bus in the middle of nowhere? She asked, her voice dripping with disbelief. Jack exhaled heavily, shifting in his seat. "Kids these days don't like authority," he muttered, "always looking for a reason to play the victim." Amelia's hands curled into fists under the table, but her expression remained calm. "This isn't about authority. It's about you abusing your position to target and harass a child. You think that's acceptable?" Principal Edwards cleared his throat, his discomfort evident. "Mr. Hunter, these are serious allegations. Have there been other incidents we should be aware of?" Jack hesitated for a fraction of a second, his gaze flickering toward the principal. "I treat all the kids the same," he said finally. "Some just take things too personally." Amelia leaned forward slightly, her tone even but filled with quiet fury. "That's a lie. My daughter isn't the first student you've mistreated, and I can guarantee she won't be the last if we allow you to continue driving a bus full of children." Jack's smirk faltered. "You think you can come in here and tell me how to do my job just because you're the mayor?" His voice was sharp now, defensive. "Maybe you should worry less about buses and more about running this town." Amelia didn't blink. "I am running this town," she said. "And that includes making sure people like you don't abuse their authority. If you can't treat children with the respect and care they deserve, then you have no business being in charge of their safety." Principal Edwards cleared his throat again, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Mr. Hunter, until we complete our investigation, you are suspended from your duties, effective immediately." Jack's face turned red. "Suspended?" he repeated, his voice rising. "This is ridiculous." "The decision is final," Edwards said, his tone firm. "We will conduct interviews with students and review any prior complaints. If the findings support Mrs. White's allegations, further action will be taken." Jack shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This isn't over," he snapped before storming out of the room. Silence hung in the air as the door slammed shut behind him. Amelia exhaled slowly, keeping her composure. "Principal Edwards, I appreciate your swift action, but I want assurances that this will be handled properly. I don't intend to let this issue fade into bureaucracy." Edwards nodded, rubbing his temples. "We'll conduct a thorough review. If what Melanie described is true, Jack Hunter won't be allowed back on any school bus." "Good," Amelia said, standing. "I'll be following up." She left the room, her heels clicking against the polished floors. She wasn't just fighting for her daughter, she was fighting for every child who had been silenced by fear. Meanwhile, word of Jack Hunter's suspension spread quickly. By the time school let out, students were whispering in hushed tones, speculating about what had happened. Some were shocked, others indifferent. But a few, the ones who had been on the receiving end of Jack's cruelty, felt something different. Relief. Melanie, however, remained unsure how to feel. As she climbed into her mother's car at the end of the school day, she hesitated before speaking. "Is it really over?" she asked. Amelia started the engine, glancing at her daughter in the rearview mirror. "Not yet," she admitted. "But it's a start." Melanie nodded, looking out the window. The road ahead still felt uncertain, but for the first time, she believed that things might actually change. Whispered, his tone dripping with disdain. "Always running to Mommy." Melanie's stomach twisted, but she kept her eyes on her notebook, pretending not to hear. She had hoped that, after everything, things would settle down. Instead, it felt like she had been placed under a magnifying glass, every movement scrutinized, every whisper amplified. The weight of the attention pressed down on her, making it difficult to focus. At lunch, she carried her tray to her usual spot, a quiet corner of the cafeteria where she could avoid most of the noise. As she sat down, she noticed a few classmates casting glances her way, their expressions unreadable. She sighed, pushing her food around her plate. The events of the past day still lingered in her mind. Jack's cruel smirk, the loneliness of the long walk home, the quiet determination in her mother's voice. Meanwhile, at City Hall, Amelia was dealing with the backlash firsthand. A press conference had been hastily organized to address the controversy swirling around Jack Hunter's suspension. Reporters, parents, and community members filled the room, their murmurs creating a low hum of tension. Amelia took her place at the podium, scanning the crowd. She knew this wouldn't be easy. Some people would stand with her, but others would see this as an overreach, an abuse of her position. But she wasn't here to win a popularity contest. She was here to do what was right. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady. "I'm here today to address the concerns surrounding the recent suspension of school bus driver Jack Hunter. Let me be clear. This decision was not made lightly. My daughter was forced off a school bus and left alone on a deserted road. That is not an allegation. That is a fact." A murmur rippled through the audience. A reporter raised his hand. "Mayor White, some residents believe this is a personal vendetta rather than a legitimate disciplinary action. How do you respond to that?" Amelia's jaw tightened. "This isn't about personal feelings. This is about ensuring the safety of every child in our community. If it had been your child, would you still call this a vendetta?" Another reporter spoke up. "There are claims that your policies on transportation reform have already caused tension with the district's drivers. Some feel this is an extension of that battle." Amelia exhaled slowly, maintaining her composure. "My role as mayor is to create policies that benefit the community. If ensuring that bus drivers follow basic standards of safety and respect is considered controversial, then I welcome that controversy. However, let's not conflate broader policy discussions with what happened to my daughter. This was an individual's misconduct, and it is being addressed as such." The room was silent for a moment. Then another voice, this time from a parent in the crowd. "What happens next?" Amelia straightened her shoulders. "The district is conducting a full investigation. If their findings confirm what we already know, Jack Hunter will never drive another school bus in this town again. Beyond that, I intend to push for stricter oversight and accountability measures to ensure that no child experiences what my daughter went through." The press conference ended, but the divide within the community remained. Some praised Amelia's stance, while others accused her of overstepping. Social media buzzed with debates, and the local news ran segment after segment on the unfolding situation. At school, Melanie continued to feel the weight of it all. The whispers, the stares, the feeling of being caught in something much bigger than herself. But there were moments, small, unexpected ones, that reminded her she wasn't alone. A girl from her history class quietly told her she was brave. A teacher gave her an encouraging nod in the hallway. Even some of the students who had laughed at Jack's comments before now seemed unsure, hesitant. By the time she got home that evening, she felt drained. Amelia was waiting for her in the living room, the news still playing in the background. She turned off the TV and patted the spot next to her on the couch. "How was school?" Melanie shrugged. "Weird." Amelia chuckled softly. "I imagine so." For a moment they sat in comfortable silence. Then Melanie took a deep breath. "Do you think people will believe me?" Amelia's expression softened. "Not everyone will. But the truth doesn't depend on whether people believe it or not. You know what happened, and you know it was wrong. That's enough." Melanie nodded, letting those words settle. Maybe this wasn't over. Maybe things would still be hard for a while, but for the first time in days, she felt a little lighter. a little less alone. The fight wasn't finished, but at least she knew she wasn't fighting it alone. Not shy away from it. The room remained tense as murmurs spread through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others whispered amongst themselves, their skepticism evident. Amelia let the weight of her words settle before stepping back from the podium. She knew that not everyone would support her stance, but she wasn't here to appease the doubters. She was here to fight for what was right. Back at school, Melanie still felt the impact of the controversy surrounding her. The whispers hadn't stopped, and neither had the stares. As she walked through the hallways, it felt as though every glance carried unspoken judgment. She tried to keep her head down, but the weight of it all pressed on her shoulders like an invisible burden. At lunch, she sat at her usual spot in the far corner of the cafeteria. The noise of the room hummed around her, but she felt disconnected from it. Her sandwich remained untouched as she absent-mindedly traced patterns on the tabletop. She wished she could disappear, to fade into the background until all of this was over. But the stares lingered, and the hushed voices never truly faded. Across the room, a girl from her history class hesitated before approaching her table. "Hey, Melanie," she said softly. Melanie glanced up, wary. "Hi." The girl shifted uncomfortably but offered a small smile. "I just wanted to say what happened wasn't right, and what you did, what your mom did, was really brave." Melanie blinked in surprise. She had expected the whispers, the rumors, even the hostility, but not this. "Thanks," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The girl hesitated, then gestured toward another table. "If you ever want to sit with us, you're welcome to." Melanie nodded, a small flicker of warmth breaking through the cold isolation she had been feeling. "Maybe," she said, the weight on her chest feeling just a little lighter. Meanwhile, at City Hall, Amelia wrapped up the press conference, leaving the podium with her head held high. She knew this battle was far from over. There would be more meetings, more pushback, more people questioning her motives. But she was prepared for it. This wasn't just about Melanie. This was about ensuring that no child would ever have to experience what her daughter had endured. As she stepped into her office, she exhaled, finally allowing herself a moment to breathe. Her phone buzzed with messages, some of support and others filled with criticism. She ignored them for now. What mattered was that she had taken a stand, and she wasn't backing down. Later that evening, Melanie and Amelia sat together on the couch, the news playing softly in the background. Melanie leaned against her mother, feeling, for the first time in days, a sense of comfort. "Do you think it'll stop?" Melanie asked. "The whispers, the looks?" Amelia sighed, wrapping an arm around her daughter. "Not right away, but eventually people will move on, and the ones who matter, they'll see the truth." Melanie nodded, letting those words sink in. Maybe things wouldn't be easy, but at least she wasn't facing them alone. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a little bit of hope. Ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Melanie believed it could lead to something better. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Amelia and Melanie sat on their front porch, the crisp evening air settling around them. The echoes of the rally still rang in Melanie's ears, the cheers, the support, the unexpected sense of empowerment she had felt while standing before the crowd. She had never imagined herself in that position, but now she understood why her mother had pushed her to speak. "How do you feel now?" Amelia asked, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Melanie exhaled, staring at the darkening sky. "Better, I think. I was scared at first, but..." It felt good to say it out loud, to let people know what happened. Amelia smiled, pride shining in her eyes. "You did more than just speak. You made people listen." Melanie nodded, her fingers tracing absent-mindedly along the armrest of her chair. "Do you think things will change?" Elder Thomas smiled. Her mother sighed, folding her hands in her lap. "Change takes time, sweetheart, but every voice, every stand we take pushes us closer to something better." Melanie absorbed those words, letting them settle within her. The fear, the anxiety, and the weight of the past few days still clung to her, but it no longer felt so suffocating. Over the next few days, the momentum from the rally continued to grow. The town buzzed with discussions, social media flooded with debates, and the local news aired segment after segment about the school bus drivers' actions and the larger issues at hand. Some residents doubled down on their belief that Amelia was using her influence unfairly, while others praised her for taking action to protect not just her daughter, but every student in the district. At school, Melanie noticed subtle changes. Some students still whispered, still avoided her gaze, but others approached her with quiet words of encouragement. A few even shared their own experiences. Small moments of injustice they had never spoken about before. It wasn't much, but it was something. One afternoon, as she packed her books into her locker, a boy from her class hesitated nearby before finally speaking. "Hey, Melanie." She turned, surprised. "Yeah?" He shifted on his feet, looking uncomfortable. I just wanted to say I think what happened to you was messed up, and that driver, he had it coming." Melanie blinked, taken aback. "Oh, thanks." He nodded, then hurried away before she could say anything else. Melanie stared after him, realizing that, little by little, things were shifting. Meanwhile, at City Hall, Amelia continued to push for stronger policies regarding student safety. The school district announced that an official investigation was underway, and soon after it was confirmed that the bus driver, Jack Hunter, had been permanently removed from his position. Though some protested the decision, the overwhelming response was relief. Parents, teachers, and community leaders began discussing ways to ensure better oversight of school staff moving forward. When Amelia shared the news with Melanie that evening, she expected her daughter to react with excitement. But Melanie simply nodded, her expression unreadable. "Aren't you happy?" Amelia asked gently. Melanie hesitated before answering. "I don't know. I'm glad he's gone. But it doesn't change what happened." Amelia reached for her hand, squeezing it. "No, it doesn't. But it means he won't be able to do it to anyone else." Melanie sighed. "I just wish none of it ever happened in the first place." Her mother nodded. "I know, sweetheart. But sometimes the hardest things we go through are the ones that create the most change." As the days passed, life slowly returned to a new normal. The stares at school faded, the news cycle moved on, and the community found other things to focus on. But for Melanie, something had changed forever. She wasn't just the mayor's daughter anymore. She was someone who had stood up, spoken out, and refused to be silenced. And that, she realized, was something to be proud of. Math class hesitated before stepping forward. "Hey, Melanie," she said shyly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I just wanted to say, what you did at the rally was really brave. I don't think I could have done that." Melanie blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected kindness. "Oh, thanks," she said, offering a small smile. The girl nodded, then hesitated before adding, "If you ever want to sit with us at lunch, you're welcome to." For the first time in weeks, Melanie felt something shift, a crack in the loneliness that had surrounded her. "I might take you up on that," she said, and the girl smiled before walking away. At home, Amelia continued to fight for the new safety measures, attending meetings, answering questions from reporters, and standing firm in the face of opposition. Some parents pushed back, arguing that cameras on buses were an invasion of privacy. Others claimed that stricter hiring policies would make it harder to find drivers. But Amelia remained unwavering. "This isn't about making things harder for adults," she stated in one meeting. "It's about making things safer for kids." Meanwhile, the school district officially announced that Jack Hunter would not be reinstated. His termination sparked debate, but the overwhelming majority of parents agreed that no child should ever be subjected to the kind of treatment Melanie had endured. One evening, as Amelia prepared dinner, Melanie set the table, glancing at her mother. "Do you think things will really change?" she asked. Amelia sighed, setting down a dish. Change is slow, sweetheart, but every step forward matters. Melanie nodded, considering her mother's words. She thought back to that terrifying walk home, the fear and exhaustion pressing down on her, the feeling of being utterly alone. But she wasn't alone anymore. People had listened. People had cared. And that, she realized, was how real change began. As the days passed, the whispers at school faded. Some students still kept their distance, but others started treating her differently, not as the mayor's daughter, but as Melanie. She even found herself invited to study groups, and the occasional small talk at lunch no longer felt so forced. At City Hall, Amelia pushed forward with her initiatives. With the community divided, she knew that not everyone would agree with her. But she also knew that protecting children was a fight worth having. The installation of cameras on school buses began that fall, and while some parents still grumbled about it, many were relieved to know that their children were safer. One night, Melanie sat on the porch with her mother, watching the stars. "You know," she said, "I think you were right." Amelia arched an eyebrow. "About what?" Melanie smiled, hugging her knees to her chest. "That standing up for what's right isn't easy, but it's worth it." Her mother reached over, squeezing her hand. "Yes, it is." Melanie still didn't know what the future held, but she did know one thing. She was stronger than she had ever realized, and no matter what happened next, she would keep moving forward. Melanie was gathering her books when a girl from her math class hesitated before stepping forward. "Hey, Melanie," she said shyly. "I just wanted to say, what you did at the rally was really brave. I don't think I could have done that." Melanie blinked in surprise. "Oh, thanks," she replied. The girl smiled warmly. "If you ever want to sit with us at lunch, you're welcome to." A small spark of warmth flickered in Melanie's chest. "Thanks. I might take you up on that." The conversation was brief, but it left Melanie feeling lighter. Slowly, she was finding her place again. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the town, Amelia and Melanie sat together on the front porch. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of blooming flowers. Amelia sipped her tea, her gaze thoughtful as she reflected on the past few weeks. "You've been quiet," she said, glancing at Melanie. "How are you feeling?" Melanie shrugged, tugging at the hem of her sweatshirt. "Better, I guess. It's just been a lot." Amelia nodded. "It has, but you've handled it with so much strength. I hope you know how proud I am of you." Melanie looked up at her mother, a small smile forming on her lips. "I couldn't have done it without you." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the first stars appeared in the night sky. The world felt calmer now, the chaos of recent events finally settling. Though the journey had been difficult, they both knew they had come out stronger. Amelia reached over and took Melanie's hand. "We've still got work to do," she said softly, "but I think we're on the right path." Melanie nodded, her grip tightening slightly. "Yeah. One step at a time." As the night wrapped around them, they shared a quiet sense of hope, a belief that change, no matter how difficult, was always worth fighting for. Life often presents challenges that test our strength, but the story of Melanie reminds us that resilience and courage can lead to meaningful change. Injustice thrives in silence, and speaking up, even when it's uncomfortable, is a step toward making things better, not just for ourselves, but for others who may be suffering in silence. Standing up for what's right isn't easy. It may come with whispers, doubts, and even opposition, but as Amelia taught Melanie, the truth doesn't depend on who believes it. Strength isn't about never falling, it's about getting up every time we do. We must remember that change takes time, and not everyone will support it, but every act of bravery, every voice that refuses to be silenced, pushes society toward fairness and justice. No child, no person, should be left alone in their struggles. Together we can build a world where doing the right thing isn't just an option, It's the expectation. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss news stories that make you think. Watch other videos for inspiration and powerful stories. Share this video with your friends to spread awareness of important issues.